It began with a sound that no one could quite describe. Some said it was a low rumble, like distant thunder rolling across the harbor. Others swore it was sharper, a gunshot, or perhaps the crack of a whip from some unseen giant. But by the time people realized what was happening, it was already too late. Boston's North End, a crowded, working-class neighborhood pulsing with life, was about to face one of the strangest disasters in American history. And it wouldn't come from fire, or war, or even storm. No, it would come from something sweet, sticky, and completely unexpected. Molasses. Thick, dark, slow-moving molasses. But on that cold January afternoon in 1919, it wouldn't be slow at all. It would move faster than a galloping horse. It would crush homes, split iron girders, and drown a city street in a wave taller than a man.
Prelude to disaster. To understand how such madness could even happen, we need to step back to a time when America itself was boiling. The Great War had just ended. Soldiers were returning home, industry was roaring, and prohibition was knocking at the door. In Boston's Harbor District, industry meant one thing: the Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of U.S. Industrial Alcohol. The company imported molasses from the Caribbean by the shipload, pumping it into a massive steel tank on Commercial Street. The molasses was then processed into industrial alcohol, used for everything from munitions to liquor. The tank itself was a behemoth, 50 feet tall, 90 feet wide, and capable of holding over 2.3 million gallons of molasses. Its curved steel sides gleamed faintly against the winter sky, a symbol of modern progress and industrial power. To the company's executives, it was nothing short of a triumph. But to the people who lived nearby, mostly Italian immigrants, dock workers, and families packed into tenement apartments, the tank was something else entirely. It groaned. It leaked. It oozed sweet syrup from its seams like blood from a wound. Children loved it, of course. They'd come running with cups to scoop up the molasses that dripped down its sides. Some even nicknamed it the Sweet Giant. But the adults weren't so charmed. They'd heard the noises, the strange metallic creaks and sighs that echoed through the nights. No one knew it yet, but that tank was a time bomb.
The anatomy of a mistake. The man responsible for the tank's construction was Arthur Gell, a mid-level manager for U.S. Industrial Alcohol. He wasn't an engineer, not really. He was a businessman, a man of deadlines and paperwork. The company was in a rush to capitalize on wartime demand, and Gell was under pressure to deliver. So, when the tank was built in 1915, it was done quickly, perhaps too quickly. Workers weren't trained engineers either, and the steel plates used for the tank were dangerously thin, just half an inch thick in some places. Worse, the tank was never properly tested. When workers filled it with water to check for leaks, it began to drip immediately. Rather than fix it, Gell ordered it filled with molasses anyway. He even painted the entire structure brown to hide the stains. It worked for a while. The war years brought profit and purpose. But by January 1919, the tide was changing. Prohibition was set to take effect that very year. The alcohol business, and with it, the value of stored molasses, was about to collapse. The company decided to offload as much molasses as possible, and the tank was filled nearly to the brim. The weather in Boston was bitterly cold that winter. Temperatures had dropped below freezing, and the steel of the tank had grown brittle. Then, on January 15th, the temperature rose suddenly from 2 degrees Fahrenheit to nearly 40 degrees Fahrenheit in a matter of hours. Inside the tank, the molasses began to ferment. Gases expanded, pressure built, and the steel began to sing.
The day the earth turned sweet. It was 12:30 p.m.,
just after lunch when the tank finally gave way. Witnesses described a sound like a machine gun, followed by a deep, rolling roar. The rivets on the tank shot through the air like bullets. Then came the explosion, a thunderous boom that shook the entire north end. The tank burst open, and 2.3 million gallons of molasses erupted into the streets. A brown wall of syrup, 25 feet high, surged forward at nearly 35 miles per hour. In its path were horses, wagons, buildings, and people. The first to die were the workers at the Purity Distilling Company. The office was instantly crushed. Nearby, a team of horses pulling a wagon was swallowed whole. The wave tore through Commercial Street, smashing the elevated railway supports, snapping them like twigs. The Boston Elevated Railway train that had just passed over the structure shook violently. Passengers screamed as the tracks twisted beneath them. Somehow the train didn't fall, but below, chaos reigned. The molasses didn't stop. It poured into the narrow streets of the North End, flooding basements, tearing porches from homes, and lifting entire buildings off their foundations. Children playing nearby were swept away. An enormous firehouse, Engine 31, was crushed as the wave hit. Firefighter George Lay was trapped under debris, fighting for his life as syrup rose around him, thick and suffocating.
The city responds. The explosion could be heard from miles. Police officers, sailors, and Red Cross workers rushed to the scene, but they could barely move. The molasses was everywhere. It was knee-deep in places, waist-deep in others, thick as tar, cold as ice. Every step was a battle. Men's boots were pulled off their feet by suction. Rescue dogs struggled to move through it. Horses that tried to gallop sank and never came up again. Everything a molasses wave touches, one witness said, it takes with it. The first rescuers arrived from the nearby USS Nantucket, a training ship moored in the harbor. Sailors plunged into the mess, hauling people out of the sticky ruin. But even then, the cries of the trapped echoed through the wreckage. The smell, sweet, sickly, overwhelming, hung in the air. Some said it made them nauseous. Others said they could never eat molasses again. By nightfall, the floodwaters had congealed into something even worse, a sticky crust that trapped everything beneath it like amber. Beneath that brown shell lay bodies, animals, and the ruins of homes. Boston had seen fires, storms, even riots, but nothing like this.
The toll of the syrup. When the sun rose the next morning, the true horror was revealed. Rescue crews worked through the night with shovels and saws, hacking through hardened molasses. They found survivors coated head to toe in syrup, barely breathing. Others were not so lucky. In total, 21 people died. 150 were injured. Dozens of horses perished. The flood destroyed entire blocks and left behind an otherworldly scene. Brown stains coating the streets, the harbor turned murky and sweet. Cleanup would take weeks, and even then, the smell lingered for decades. For years afterward, Bostonians would claim that on hot summer days, the air still smelled faintly of molasses.
The morning after the Great Molasses Flood, Boston awoke to a city transformed. Where once narrow streets had bustled with vendors, children, and the constant clatter of horse-drawn wagons, there was now a strange, sticky silence. Brown sludge clung to buildings, coated sidewalks, and filled gutters with a thickness that made walking treacherous. Windows were smeared, doors jammed, and the smell of sugar and decay hung like a dark fog over the North End. To the casual observer, it was almost surreal, a disaster lifted straight from the pages of a cautionary tale.
But for the families who had lost loved ones, it was a nightmare etched in reality. Mothers cried out for children swept away in the wave. Fathers scavenged for anything salvageable, combing through the debris, covered head to toe in molasses. The city's emergency services were overwhelmed. Even the experienced firefighters of Boston, hardened by blazes and storms, had never faced anything like this.
Rescue and recovery. Rescue operations continued long into the day. Sailors from nearby naval ships, police officers, and even ordinary citizens joined the effort. People worked tirelessly, using whatever tools were at hand: shovels, ropes, axes, and sheer brute force. Horses that had survived the flood were rounded up, shivering and coated in the sticky syrup, their hooves stuck in the mess. Bodies had to be extracted carefully. Molasses, though viscous, trapped objects with incredible force. Rescuers often had to cut through debris and hardened syrup to free the injured. The scene was harrowing. People trapped beneath overturned wagons, beneath fallen walls, and in the frozen sludge of the street. Survivors described being lifted by hands slick with syrup, their own movements hampered, as if the molasses itself resisted rescue. The dead were carried away quietly, leaving behind a street transformed into a nightmarish tableau. Every building bore scars, doors ripped from hinges, windows shattered, even bricks dislodged by the pressure of the wave. Boston had experienced disasters before, but none had left such a bizarre, lingering mark.
The investigation began. Once immediate rescue and recovery efforts subsided, attention turned to the cause. How could a single molasses tank unleash such destruction? Questions flew through Boston newspapers, which published dramatic headlines. "The Sweet Giant strikes! Molasses tsunami kills dozens!" Engineers and city officials began to examine the tank itself. Photographs revealed the shattered steel, twisted and torn apart by pressures that should have been impossible. Investigators discovered that the tank, built in 1915, had been poorly designed. Its walls were thin and weak. Rivets had been improperly installed, and most critically, there had been no safety inspections, no rigorous stress tests, nothing to ensure that the massive structure could withstand the pressures of winter and fermentation. Experts concluded that the disaster was a combination of human error, shoddy construction, and natural forces. The sudden warming of the weather caused molasses to expand and ferment. The tank, already weakened by years of leaks and improper welding, could not contain the pressure, and when it finally burst, the result was catastrophic.
The legal battle. The human toll was matched by a legal storm. Survivors and families of the deceased sought justice. The Purity Distilling Company, once a symbol of industrial progress, found itself under intense scrutiny. Boston's courts were flooded with lawsuits, and the case dragged on for years. One of the most notable aspects of the legal proceedings was the use of scientific and engineering testimony. For the first time in U.S. history, engineers were called upon to testify about structural failures in a court of law. They explained how steel fatigue, poor rivet work, and improper materials had created a disaster waiting to happen. After a 7-year legal battle, the company was found liable for the deaths and destruction. Compensation was awarded to the victims' families, though no amount of money could truly restore the lives lost or the trauma endured by survivors. Boston's transformation. The disaster prompted a fundamental shift
in building codes and industrial regulations. The city of Boston, and eventually the entire United States, recognized the need for strict oversight of industrial storage facilities. Steel tanks had to be tested rigorously, materials had to meet standards, and engineers were no longer optional consultants. They became essential. The North End itself slowly recovered. Streets were rebuilt, homes repaired, and businesses reopened. But the memory of the molasses flood lingered. Residents spoke of molasses days, and even decades later, locals would recall the smell that seemed to permeate the summer air. Some claimed that on hot days, the brown residue could still be smelled in the city streets.
The human stories. Beyond statistics and structural failures, the flood left countless human stories. Families who survived clung to each other in the aftermath, their bonds strengthened by the shared trauma. Rescuers who had risked their lives became heroes in local lore. Children who had been swept away and rescued told tales that would be passed down for generations. One particularly haunting story was that of Carmen and Mario, siblings who had been playing near the Purity distilling tank. Swept away by the wave, they were trapped beneath debris and molasses for hours. Rescuers finally freed them, coated in syrup from head to toe, shaking but alive. Their mother later recalled the moment as miraculous, a stark reminder of life amid devastation. Other stories were tragic. Entire families were lost in the flood. Pets and livestock perished alongside humans. Neighborhoods that had once been vibrant were scarred forever. The flood, though unusual in its source, revealed the fragility of life in the industrial age, where progress often outpaced safety.
A lesson in scale and surprise. The Great Molasses Flood is often remembered today as an oddity, a disaster born of something sweet rather than fire or storm. But at the time, it was a stark lesson in industrial responsibility. The flood demonstrated that even seemingly harmless substances, when stored on a massive scale under poor conditions, could unleash unimaginable destruction. For Boston, the disaster became a story passed down through generations, a cautionary tale about industry, oversight, and the unexpected dangers that lurk in everyday life. Engineers, city planners, and historians still study the flood, not only for its bizarre spectacle, but for the lessons it provides about human error, greed, and hubris.
The years following the Great Molasses Flood were not kind to the North End, yet they were a testament to human resilience. Boston slowly stitched itself back together. Streets were repaired, basements dug out, and businesses reopened. The sticky brown residue that had coated the city was scrubbed away, but the memories remained, etched into the city's architecture, its culture, and the consciousness of those who had survived. Even decades later, residents would talk of molasses days, a term that became shorthand for tragedy, danger, and the fragile veneer of urban life. Scholars, engineers, and curious tourists alike would marvel at the story. Part cautionary tale, part absurdity, part horror.
The engineering revolution. The flood catalyzed a nationwide reevaluation of industrial safety. Steel tanks, chemical storage, and large-scale industrial equipment were now subject to rigorous inspection and certification. The disaster became a reference point in engineering textbooks, a vivid example of what can happen when greed, haste, and neglect meet physics and chemistry. Building codes were rewritten. Safety inspectors were empowered. Engineering ethics were elevated to a public concern. In many ways, the flood shaped modern industrial America. It was a reminder that progress, unchecked, could produce consequences as strange as they were deadly. Cultural memory. In the hearts of Bostonians, the flood became a story passed from parent to child, a shared legend with all the drama of myth. Children imagined the wave as a living creature, a monstrous serpent that roared through the streets. Adults spoke of the sticky smell that lingered for years and the surreal sight of buildings half buried in brown sludge. Writers and journalists chronicled the disaster in books, newspapers, and oral histories. The flood appeared in historical retrospectives as both a tragic loss of life and a bizarre, almost surreal anomaly. It reminded Americans that disasters don't always come from fire, storm, or battle. Sometimes they come from the everyday materials we take for granted. Even today, Boston holds remnants of that history. In the North End, older residents can point to locations where the molasses wave ran deepest, telling tales with an almost reverent solemnity. Museums and historical societies preserve photographs and artifacts, reminding visitors that this extraordinary event truly happened, that a wave of sticky syrup once rolled through the streets and reshaped a city.
The people behind the disaster. Arthur Gell, the manager responsible for the tank's construction, faded into obscurity, his career marred by lawsuits and scandal. The Purity Distilling Company faced financial ruin, largely as a result of the 7-year litigation following the flood. Yet, despite the legal closure, the human scars remained. Families who had lost children, spouses, or parents carried the trauma for decades. Yet there were also stories of heroism. Rescuers who risked their lives in the thick molasses became local legends. Ordinary citizens displayed extraordinary courage, from sailors diving into syrup to save drowning children, to neighbors working tirelessly to clear the sticky streets. Their bravery became part of Boston's collective identity, a story of resilience amid chaos.
The science of disaster. Modern analysis of the Great Molasses Flood has shed light on why it was so deadly. Molasses, when cold, becomes incredibly viscous, almost like a gelatin, but when slightly warmed, it flows with surprising speed. In the tank, the sudden temperature change caused fermentation and expansion, dramatically increasing pressure against weak steel walls. The result was not just a flood. It was a wave traveling faster than any person could run, carrying debris, wagons, and people in its wake. Scientists and engineers today study the disaster to understand fluid dynamics, industry engineering, and the unexpected dangers of large-scale storage, making it far more than a quirky anecdote.
Legacy in modern Boston. The flood also left an unexpected legacy in urban planning. Boston learned to respect the scale of industry within city limits. Regulations were implemented to prevent large chemical or food storage facilities from threatening dense residential neighborhoods. Public awareness of industrial hazards grew, shaping Boston into a city that balanced commerce, safety, and community. The Great Molasses Flood has become more than just history. It is a symbol of the fragility of human ambition. It reminds us that disasters can emerge from the most ordinary places: a syrup tank, a factory, a simple oversight. And it is a testament to the resilience of a community that rebuilt, remembered, and told its story to the world.
Epilogue: a sweet, dark memory. Today, visitors walking through Boston's North End might never suspect that one of the strangest disasters in U.S. history occurred there. The streets bustle with restaurants, cafes, and markets. Children play in the same alleys where molasses once surged like a tide. Yet, if you listen closely, the story echoes, a reminder of how quickly normal life can turn catastrophic, how human error can collide with natural forces, and how courage can shine in the darkest, stickiest of moments. The Great Molasses Flood was more than a moment of chaos. It was a lesson in humility, science, and human resilience. It was a reminder that history often mixes the bizarre with the tragic, leaving behind tales that are both horrifying and unforgettable. In the end, Boston survived. The streets were rebuilt, the tank was gone, but the story of a wave of syrup that destroyed a neighborhood, claimed lives, and reshaped industrial law remains, flowing through the city's memory like molasses through time, slow, dark, and impossible to forget.